Hi there. I want to talk to you about ducts. Do your ducts seem old-fashioned, out of date? Central Services' new duct designs are now available in hundreds of different colors to suit your individual taste. Hurry now, while stocks last, to your nearest Central Services showroom. Designer colors to suit your demanding taste.
Central Services.
Greetings, friends. This is Henrik Palmgren. I hope you are doing well and that you feel good wherever you are. Welcome to everyone listening from around the world. This is independent radio for free-thinking individuals that can and have the ability to think outside any of the boxes that are placed over our heads and that we sometimes even fall into ourselves. We are grateful to have you with us and that you want to spend some of your time with us today and learn through listening as we go searching for answers to some of the puzzles in this world and beyond. We always put the guest and the topic first so that you can decide for yourself what to make of the material that is discussed. Our good friend Neil Kramer finally returns to Red Ice Radio to talk with us about his latest material, new developments, travels, and the Dystopian Daydream from the point of view of the excellent film Brazil. We talk about the artificial constructs around us and how to generate our own level of reality, the Akashic field, cultural programming, and how to break that code. We discuss the dreamscape and the recurring problems in our world with cultural depression and financial collapse, and how taking responsibility and taking back the flame of authenticity are key aspects to generate your own level of reality. Alrighty, Neil Kramer, it's wonderful to have you back with us again on the show, and I think it would be really good to begin to talk a little bit about your latest article, or one of your latest articles, From Britain to Brazil, Owning the Dystopian Daydream. And Neil, I personally have always been enjoying Terry Gilliam's films. He has a really astute eye in terms of symbolism, archetypes, and whatever he's putting out, it's a really good stuff. And Brazil has been one of my favorite movies for a really long time. And I see by your latest article, obviously, as well, that you've really gotten into the movie and have broken it down. And I mean, at this point, I can't really mention anything else beyond the fact that, I mean, we are living in the dystopia in one way. We are living in Terry Gilliam's Brazil. That's all I can say, and that's the way I see it at this point. But tell us a little bit about what you think of Brazil and why you think it's such a good kind of example, I guess, in terms of describing our world today, Neil.
Well, I think that Gilliam is, as you say, is a bit of a maverick in terms of the way he likes to do things and his refusal to compromise his creative dynamic and his creative vision. And therefore he is always going to run into difficulties with the studio system and the funding system that really makes a lot of movies actually manifest onto our screens. So for that very reason alone, I've always liked him. So his insistence on shaping the vision exactly the way he wants to do it has meant that a number of his films, and for me particularly his film Brazil, which was released in 1985 now, which is an incredibly long time ago. Those films depict a certain texture and a certain tonality of this dystopia, of this control system manifestation, that at the time seemed very bizarre and very fantastical. And yet now, having watched it again quite recently, most of the things in that film have actually come to pass and are actually now part of European, UK, and US social fabric, and that is the way things are. And what's most disturbing about it is that the tacit acceptance of the society that completely goes along with this apparatus that, you know, ceaselessly lays itself down upon the people. So most of the time, if you go to somebody in where I derive from, so to speak, England, and say, what do you think of the fascist state apparatus that has gradually been, you know, reaching its tentacles into our everyday lives? Most people just look at you as if you've come from another planet and they don't really understand what you're saying. And even if you use less provocative language and say, don't you think that the government has overstepped the mark in terms of its reach into one's personal life and its desire to shape everything that we do and all the things that we can't do? People don't really see that very often. And I'm aware that these are big sweeping generalizations I'm making. And of course, for your listeners and for people who research and study these kinds of topics, it's not quite the case because people are obviously more informed.
Right.
I'm talking about Joe Public, the normal guy in the street. As long as the system consistently frames what it is to be a human being, which is always focusing the individual on what they have, then the individual will always concede to the principles that the system puts upon them. So as long as they can continue to go to the supermarket and put petrol into their cars and watch television and freely walk around the streets and go and eat in a restaurant or go on holiday for 2 weeks to Portugal or whatever, then they're quite happy. And if you measure one's personal life on that basis, things are much the same as they were a generation ago. If, however, you start to look at personal freedoms and personal liberties from a more abstract and more zoomed out level, it's completely different now. So 10 years ago, the landscape is, to me, from what I perceive and what I look at, is unrecognizable from what it is in 2010. And it's certainly distinctly different from when I was a child or 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old kid. Things are incredibly different. So the social, the financial, and the sort of the morale of the people is different. There's definitely a more pressurized sense of consciousness being held in place. And again, people who don't think in those terms, it's difficult to describe that to those people. And to be quite honest with you, I rarely try. It's not something I'm interested in doing.
Yeah.
I consistently say this, and nobody should be necessarily trying to wake anyone up. You just play your own game and you work on your own consciousness, and we'll come to this later in the session. But in so doing, that's the best way you can wake people up, and I'll explain that fully later. But even in casual encounters with people in just down the street or on the train or in restaurants or in the supermarket or whatever, you get a sense of conversation of what people are focusing on, what people are doing. And of course, a lot of our friends and family have a distinct disdain for this kind of information because it makes them essentially feel uncomfortable. And it's not something they really want to talk about. So the system, one of the control system's little deceits, one of its little tricks, is to keep people comfortable. And when you do that, as other researchers have pointed out, you don't necessarily need this overt level of control. It can be relatively covert. But the interesting sort of corollary for that is that when people are comfortable, they're less likely to get upset about increasing numbers of speed cameras and surveillance cameras and, all these different taxations and stuff. They just see it as part and parcel of modern life, and that's the way things are. And, oh, well, let's just get on with it and make sure we try and keep a few dollars or a few pounds aside to mitigate any problems that might happen. The main thing here is people need to recognize, and again, we're talking about two distinct types of people. People who concentrate on self-awareness probably have already recognized this, but people who do not, who only move within the social and the cultural edifice that has been the default reality construct for them, they are not aware that they live in an artificial construct. They are not aware that the world they live in is derived from, a fantasy, essentially, is derived from a fake matrix that is not strictly representational of what we actually have before us. So you have to draw people's attention to analyze this machinery and to look at these complex systems of management. But as soon as you talk in those terms, people think, yeah, whatever. Sure, yeah, I think I'll just go and get a pizza and a beer instead, actually. That might be good, and go and watch Battlestar Galactica instead. Which is, I like those three things as well. But,
nothing wrong with that, though. But yeah.
No, there's nothing wrong with that. But by design, the construct kind of normalizes the perception of everything and everybody. And it becomes, as I might say, the default gravitation for those individuals who decide not to generate reality from their own field of creation. So there is a distinct disowning of reality. They say, well, reality is just this big space that we all get put into, and reality is as reality is, and there's nothing we can do about it. And the reason most people choose not to generate their reality is simply because they don't realize that they can.
Yeah.
Now, all this information is not in the public scope of normal libraries and television and broadcasts and so on. It's not there.
For a reason as well, obviously.
That's right, yeah. And the slivers of knowledge and wisdom that do filter into the public domain are just far too oblique and fragile for a mainstream culture-saturated mind to take hold of, let alone understand. And that is the deceit. So I would say that the propagation of the construct into a consensus belief system is a sort of primary edict of the control system. It's not an elective thing. And its parameters are instilled into us from birth. And we call this normality. It's normal. This is normal. Taxation is normal. Erosion of civil liberties is normal. Having diseases is normal. Going to the hospital is normal. Watching television is normal. And that is the trick of the control system. So we're trained in this completely homogeneous apparatus, its procedures, its policies, its conventions, and so on. And even for intelligent people who look beyond the surface of this, nevertheless we imbibe its science, its religion, its legalities, its restrictions. Everything is labeled, recorded, and filed. And this is where we start to connect to Brazil. Yeah. And this conditioning, this construct is echoed through all hubs, if you like, of the system. So it doesn't only just come through the literature and the media, but it comes from our parents, from our schools and universities, our workplaces, and even the mouths of our friends and family, as we said earlier, and certainly through the media. But it's everywhere. Everywhere we look, this construct stares back at us. And I would say that the danger is that a prolonged exposure to this has what we could summarize as a despiritualizing effect on the human psyche. It makes you just into a machine, a biological machine, and it reduces you down to just nuts and bolts. And of course, that is an aspect of us. And when we talk about metaphysical concepts, we always have to acknowledge that we are multidimensional in the sense that, yes, perhaps we do have a metaphysical, higher dimensional spiritual aspect, but we also are an animal. We also are flesh and blood, and we sweat and piss and shit and eat and fuck and all the crude, gross, material level things that all the other animals do. Yeah, we do those things. But when you despiritualize somebody, the play, the creation, and the charm of existence begins to evaporate. And people acknowledge at a deep level in their heart that they're living lives they do not want to live. The families, relationships, jobs, finances become dysfunctional, become untrue. So whether somebody's life is completely off the rails or completely on track, life does not satisfy. It does not satisfy anymore, and perhaps it never did. And the only respite from this sort of perpetual gloom, really, is this fleeting relief that is afforded by distraction and sensual pleasure. And we all know what those things look like. And yes, we all partake in those things from time to time, whether it's just a nice night out, a few beers, TV, a movie, all those things. They're all good things. But when they are offered up as the only respite, as the only reward for living life, something has gone terribly wrong. And so even the most cynical hedonist who leads a life of total debauchery knows deep in his or her heart that the sort of squalor of this sensual infusion is a very, very poor surrogate for what should be a very inspired exhilaration with life.
Yeah. It's a shallow supplement, or not even that. It's you're trying to have something to fulfill, obviously a hole that is there as well. And all of this goes back to as you mentioned before, obviously a kind of a cultural programming as well that takes place. And I think that on top of these things that you mentioned that are incredibly important, it's also, I would put into that picture, a level of comparison is very important as well. For instance, although these are horrible things that are happening, but for example, by people in other countries being subjected to images of, say, starving kids in Africa or what have you, this serves its purpose as well, because you can always compare and say, well, at least I'm not having it as bad as this situation or what have you. So people kind of come to accept their servitude in a way, and kind of they're happy that they're at least in a position where they can go inside at night and flick around the TV and you know, have a burger or whatever it is. So that's, we're not thinking about this from the point of view of how do I want to live my life regardless of what actually is happening around the planet. Again, this should not be perceived as the fact that we shouldn't take care of each other, help each other out and do what we can. That's not what I'm getting at here, but the fact that we should be able to think outside of this box. But again, then we're back to that idea that you mentioned, that this has to do with how we generate our own level of reality, and at the core of that, the base of that, you mentioned, Neil, people don't know that they have this ability, pretty much.
It is. I mean, to a lot of people, it's very esoteric to say we generate our own reality, and the reductionist or the scientific mind will say, well, what do you mean by that? Give me evidence for that. I need to know more about that. And you can point people in certain directions for this. And I spoke recently about this notion of what is perhaps become called the Akashic field, which is, Akasha is like an ancient sort of Vedic idea, Sanskrit word really for this field of interpenetrating ether, which perhaps is what it was called in Victorian occultist times, which was obviously immediately upturned by classicist sort of science to say, what are you talking about? There's nothing there. But as time's gone by, we recognize this thing as like the sort of vacuum field. And we could say that this field is sort of like a plenum that is the basic platform for all waveforms to communicate through the universe. And it's full of stuff. And rather than perceiving space and reality as this huge black space with a load of things in it, it isn't quite like that. And we see that, you know, this field has this ability to generate and conserve and convey information. And as I've said recently, that Heisenberg said that you know, that reality is built as a mathematical, not a material structure. And so when we understand that, you start to think, okay, so we're not talking about a world of objects, we're talking about a world of information, a world of potential, a world that is encoded with kind of mathematics, basically. And a very good analogy for this, again, I apologize to anyone who's been following my podcasts recently because they probably heard this, but it's such a good analogy that it bears repeating, certainly for those who haven't heard this. Most of the people who listen to this program will be familiar with using the web, right? The internet. Yeah. And when you look at a web page, as you yourself know full well, Henrik, you're actually looking at a load of code, right? And it's like HTML code, and there's like XHTML, and there's all these new varieties and stuff, but you're basically looking at a load of code, matrix-style code, mathematics, algorithms, whatever. And when you fire up Safari or Firefox or Internet Explorer or Opera, whatever your browser is, your browser interprets that code as images, as layout, as colors, as something kind of as a pictorial representation of the code. It isn't the code itself, it is a representation of it. And what the control system does is a very simple thing, but it's very profound. It only gives you one browser to look through, and it says, this is the browser, this is the interpretation of reality that you will use. There is no other, this is it. We control that translation, and everything that you see through our browser, through our matrix, is it. That is it. That is the default construct. What we need to do is recognize that the point of being here on this planet, the crucial point is to explore, is to discover, is to unfold, is to create. And anyone who doesn't see that has missed the point, I would say. And whatever your religious system is, whatever your philosophy, whatever your science is, surely those are the human principles that define us. The browser, therefore, is our own creation. We should create our own browser. We should create our own translation devices, our own filters, to either remove them or add them, and decide how we interpret the code that is there. And so it's a very important thing for people to realize that they unfold their own reality. We're responsible for this reality that we see before us. So what occurs and translates for each of us is entirely dependent on what emanates from our own consciousness. And the most damaging thing that one can do in this world is not be aware of that. Because when you're not shaping your reality, you're basically living in someone else's. Someone else is shaping it for you. So it's like the default setting is the control system reality. So they are banking on the fact that to a high degree, most people, for the entire duration of their lives, never truly question the reality, the constructs. They don't feel this impulse to explore it, to peep behind the curtain, to look at it. And sometimes when occasionally somebody does do that, there's such a cultural psychic discomposure that any sort of inquiry is immediately dropped and never returned to again in any sort of meaningful way. So culture, however colourful and rich and beautiful it is, often dissuades people from doing that. So the fail-safe of the system is that it deters people from walking what I would refer to as their ascendant path of evolution. And this dissonance that they put in arises really when the construct is questioned by anyone who inquires after it. And initially what they see is it's a mirror, and it mirrors back into them, and it shows them their own darkness. So this leads us into other areas that we'll detail a little later, but when you first examine the construct, that darkness, that shadow, that hole, that emptiness that you see is you. It is the mirror of you. So for people who dwell solely within the construct and are unacquainted with their own inner landscape of their own psyche and their own spirituality, they're really unprepared for any sort of revelatory flashes that may involve any degree of self-reevaluation. And this emptiness in their own psyche is simply too much to handle. So they retreat and they go back to the complete undisrupted terrain of the construct. And that is what the construct relies on time and time and time again. And though we can see in all the classic spiritual texts, there is an observance that one should know oneself, and that perhaps what is outside emanates only from inside. And if you really want to push that to the extreme, you could say there is no outside, there is only the inside. This gets misconstrued, this gets misunderstood over time, and this outer world gets depersonalized. And this is the key to a lot of the work I'm doing. This externalization process depersonalizes what is our responsibility. And we see that the world out there is actually starting to disconnect from us, and we don't assume responsibility for it. So, there are exceptions to this. There are those that do push through. There are spirits who do question authority and who are kind of organically defiant and will always push through this. And when you find these souls, sometimes they're political radicals or the revolutionaries or the philosophers. But when you push it to the fringe, they're terrorists or they're nutters or they're eccentrics or they're mentally ill. And the degree and duration of one's investigation into reality can determine what severity of label you get. So when you get somebody like, David Icke, who comes out with all this fantastic information and then talks about higher dimensional entities and reptilians and so on, that's very easy for the control system to box him off and put him in a certain place and categorize him.
Sure.
So we have to be very careful with the words we use. I think if you talked about trans-dimensional or hyper-dimensional things 15 years ago, it was very, very suspect and it was very, very esoteric indeed. Whereas now, as the informed individual becomes more acquainted and confident with science, and particularly quantum physics and so on, hyperdimensional physics is very mainstream now. It's very popular now. And the core concepts of it, not necessarily the mechanics of the mathematics itself, which is always best expressed as equations and, these kind of really obtruse, mathematical formulas and stuff. But the principles of it, we can all understand. We can all grab and get to. So my feeling is that there's sort of no excuse anymore to remain in ignorance. And I'm kind of quite interested in studying the Gnostics and the Gnostic system of information. And there's one of my favorite sort of texts within the Nag Hammadi texts is one called the Book of Thomas the Contender. And there's just this one line in it that I particularly enjoy, which really just sums it up for me. And it goes like this: "Woe to you who dwell in error, heedless that the light of the sun, which judges and looks down upon the all, will circle around all things so as to enslave the enemies. You do not even notice the moon, how by night and day it looks down, looking at the body of your slaughters." And to me, this says a simple thing. It says there's no excuse, people, for being ignorant. Do not dwell in error. Do not move forward in chosen distraction. It's not a way forward. And there's another line that says, "Woe to you who hope in the flesh and in the prison that will perish," which basically says, if you concentrate only on the sensual life, and by that I don't mean the erotic life, I mean of the senses, of the five sense world. If that is where you are based, you are putting yourself in a perishable world, and you are making a deity of a perishable world. And I think pretty much that's an unacceptable way to behave anymore. And whilst it is not our job to go around and wake people up and all that, and I'm really vehemently attached to the notion that the only thing we can really do, if we accept this plenum, this Akashic field, if we enlighten and better ourselves, to use a more mundane word, if we just want to keep it simple, if we concentrate on our own growth, that is the most phenomenal thing we can do to affect everyone else, because every thought you have, every emotion, every feeling, every impulse is automatically, kind of holographically shared all the time with the entire field that stretches through the whole multiverse. Nothing is separate. Nothing is decoherent. We live in this hugely interconnected, coherent universe. And again, that is a principle that the control system doesn't really want you to go into. So those nuggets are tucked away in inaccessible science books, or they're tucked away in dusty old texts that only nutters read. And that has to stop. And of course, programs like this start to overturn that nonsense and show that this information is there for all of us, and there's a kind of damn good reason for it.
But this inquisitiveness, I think, that is key to this aspect as well, though, because I mean, it's tricky to me, because there have to be something in human beings to begin with that they're interested in their surrounding, and again, if we're back to that idea that if the external is a reflection of the internal, then really what people really need to do at the most basic level is to observe their basic surrounding. Why am I in the situation I am in? Because that will speak about your internal. That will speak to you about what either you need to do in your life to change things or what have you. But those basic ideas are not there. The inquisitiveness is not there anymore. And I'm reminded of something that Michael Kramer mentioned on our show the last time he was on here, when he talked about the spiritual asylum, that it seems that we're on this progressive path or progression path of getting some kind of spiritual lesson as we're here on Earth, either if we apply this to reincarnation or not. He talked about it in terms that people should graduate from this school. But since we're getting more and more people on the planet and it's something that is failing in this system. More and more people are not graduating, and things are kind of, as he called it, we're on a devolutionary path in that sense, because people fail to ask these basic questions. They fail to have the inquisitiveness that must be there in order to understand your internal world and how you affect these things. So he put it, just to wrap that thought up, Neil, he put it in the context that it's almost like there's a spiritual, if you will, then conspiracy out there to actually keep people dumbed down for another purpose, for another motive on a spiritual level here, that the more spiritually stupid people are stuck on the planet, or spiritually stupid souls, if you want to look at it that way, stuck on the planet, they could be used for something, either in terms of energy, or again, we're back to that interdimensional aspect, that we might have interdimensional, transdimensional vampires out there that are actually feeding on people's ignorance, if you will, in one way. But what's your take on that, Neil? What is lacking, or what is the reason for that, do you think?
Well, I'd just like to offer a sort of a flippable concept here from what you just said. We've got probably 7.5, 8 billion people on this planet. I think it's something like that, the figure, isn't it? You could say that the spiritual school of three-dimensional life on Earth isn't working because people aren't graduating, people aren't succeeding in their coursework and aren't moving forward. And I can see that. And I can see how that could be interpreted that way. There's a flip side to that, and it's this. The people who are here now are also taking the opportunity of the most extraordinary times of polarization that we've ever seen. There is no clearer, more distinct demonstration of how reality unfolds from consciousness than living on this planet. And it is so polarized, it is so ridiculous, it is so brilliant all at the same time, that eventually you either have to acknowledge and understand and move forward with that, or it'll crush you. And that is what is happening on this planet. So I would say to some degree that the amount of polarization that one sees, and by that I mean how things are collapsed down into opposites so often, of peace and violence and love and hate and 0 and 1 and black and white and whatever. Those polarizations are so ridiculous now. And we examine that tonality in programs like this as regards society and civil liberties and personal freedoms and so on and so forth. But those are just human constructs. You know, I would say no one has any rights or liberties or freedoms.
Right.
And yet everybody has rights and liberties and freedoms. You know, you hear, you show up on Earth, good luck. That's it.
That's it.
There's no rights, there's no freedoms, there's no nothing. So people who get attached to that and social reform and radical political change, for me, that's a dead end. That is playing with the chess pieces that someone else has constructed. Exactly.
That's somebody else's ideas. And at the end of that, you're still not operating from your own will. We still have a will that is somebody else's. Our impulses are not our own, and even our instinctual drives, in most cases, are programmed into us, and we haven't found our own path, our own way in one way.
That's right, yeah. And I would say that to a very great degree, everything we do, everything we see, and everything we feel, and all this information that we're imbibing, we have to bring it into the personal. We cannot afford to abstract things all the time into this distant metaphysics or this distant social comment. It has to be brought into the personal, into what you actually do, into what you actually feel, into what you actually are. So my kind of litmus test, my yardstick for the gnosis and the wisdom and the information that I come upon is how can I integrate it into my actual felt experience of life? And if I cannot, I disregard it, I eject it, because that is the only thing that we have, is our felt experience. And it's important to understand, yes, I'm talking about, you know, the food you put in your mouth and the toothbrush with which you brush your teeth and all the rest of it, the nuts and bolts of reality. But consider this. In Druidic times in England, the Druids contemplated the idea that experience on Earth was a shadow and light experience, and the light experience was waking life, and the shadow experience was what we call going to sleep and dreaming. And they placed equal value on those two things. Equal value on those two things. So did the Toltec sorcerers. So did many of the Gnostic seers. We don't do that in our society. Dreams are a bit of silly fluff that you just forget when you wake up. Dreams are like nonsense. Dreams are dreams. They're just not real. And that represents where we start to see a complete bifurcation of what is real and what is unreal. And it is important to acknowledge, as a very simple example, that obviously half your time is spent asleep and half your time is spent awake. Whatever the percentages of that, it doesn't matter, but you get the point. There's a light and a dark, and it doesn't mean good and evil. It just means light and not light. It means shadow. It means illumination. It means darkness. And just as anybody who is familiar with torture techniques, one of the most cruel things you can do to a human being over an extended period of time is not give them darkness. To keep someone in a cell with a bright light on them is a very, very subtle but very, very penetrating and horrible way of torturing somebody. We need darkness. We need shadow. It's part of us. It's part of our system. It's part of our ecology. It's part of our consciousness. And so I think it's important to recognize that experience here begins to become richer and more important and more synchronous when we understand that this concept of light and shadow is central to the human experience. And it can be demonstrated by describing to you that the old Toltec sorcerers or shamans or brujos or whatever you want to call them. And when I say sorcery, again, I'll just underline this. I'm not talking about like dark sorcerers. So like, you have a good magician and a sorcerer is someone who's bad. I mean sorcerer just as someone who is interested in knowledge, in knowing, in information. So I kind of covered that on a video recently. If anyone wants to look into that, it's important to get to the root of that word. So sorcery is a neutral thing. Sorcery is working with reality at a fundamental level. That's all it means. The old Toltec sorcerers used to limit what they would do in their life, in their waking life, and they would be careful of what foods they ate. They would be careful of wearing certain colors. They would be careful of going to certain places, because those energies in those places would reduce the amount of psychic energy they had to practice their sorcery when they were asleep. And so they viewed life the other way around. Their sleep was the real important, juicy, exciting bit, and the waking life was just the functional bit. And yes, they would go out and smell the roses and walk under the trees and eat fresh, juicy peaches and all the rest of it and enjoy what is wonderful about life. But they treated that as very much the basic level of manifestation, a high density experience of life. The finer life, the freer life, was actually what happened when their consciousness, if you like, freed itself from the organism and assimilated, moved, drifted, glided, whatever you want to call it, back into the field, into the real field of creation where it is free from where we came and to where we go. And this is an interesting counterbalance just to show how fundamental the construct, how fundamental that fake browser through which we look is. So even the acceptance of the waking world as the real one and the dream world as unreal is bollocks, basically. It's not like that at all. And the only sort of interface we have between the two is so rare and is so obscure that really the only two methods we get to it is through these esoteric systems of meditation or through these questionable substances that in our society we just call drugs or hallucinogens, which properly we could perhaps describe as sacred plant medicine or entheogens or whatever. In the 60s, people call them psychedelics. And these things crop up time and time again, and it's a very divisive issue to talk about that. And yet those two methods, meditation and entheogens, are perhaps the only clear ones we have as examples of how you can interface directly between a higher density experience, i.e. physical experience, and a lower density experience, a finer, higher resolution experience, such as in what we would call a spiritual experience, where you're dealing with energy at a purer level. It's very important one's intent in this. So everything that we do is directed by our inclination, our motivation, our intent is the juice for this thing to occur. So as I was talking with somebody recently, if you talk to somebody about salvia divinorum, one person will say, there's just like teenagers take it and fall over the back of the sofa and laugh a lot and freak out. And other people will say, well, it's a sacred medicine not to be used lightly, essentially. So again, the construct dictates and upholds and steers and manages what is the perception of a given thing. And even we ourselves, if you think back to when perhaps we were younger, drugs were hammered out of the mainstream edifice. Drugs in England was like, okay, here's a couple of people who take drugs. This girl died when she took ecstasy. This guy was found in his apartment with a needle hanging out of his arm, and look at him, he's all bloated and horrible and weird, and he looks like some kind of like, potato or something. It's just grotesque. Here's somebody else who is a crack addict on the street, selling their ass, and this is what drugs do to you. This is what drugs do to you. And that message succeeded, and it continues to succeed. And I forget sometimes that some of the people I talk to are so informed and so sovereign and so conscious. I have the luxury and the privilege of speaking to people like that more often than usual. And then when I speak to somebody who is completely dwelling within the construct and who does not acknowledge themselves as an important sentient entity within it, any mention of esoteric information of any nature that isn't within the construct is frowned upon. And whether they're 20 years old or 50 years old or 80 years old, that is still the case. And I just laugh at this now. I just forget how different these two things have become. So we do observe, and other speakers and researchers and people I've met in recent years have echoed this. We do see a division in the species to some extent, and we do see a devolutionary and an evolutionary path. And ultimately, it's kind of like take the low road or take the high road. They all get there in the end. But the ascendant path is so much more fulfilling, so much more real and enjoyable. The path of reductionism, of material reality, of unthinking acceptance of the edicts and the diktats of the construct is just so negative. And as I said earlier, everybody knows in their heart that system is not designed for human beings. It's not designed for people to be creative and free and fluid and true. It doesn't do that. It does the opposite of those things. So everybody lives these lives of discontent, and the way you begin to overturn that, the way you begin to change direction, is by changing your own personal interpretation of reality. And what tends to happen then is that what we might call synchronicities start to occur in your life. And the true path, the authentic path, the path that will naturally be of greatest growth and to some degree energetically of least resistance, although it doesn't always feel like that, that path will begin to make itself clear. But it starts with the way you think and the way you feel. And those are the terms we could perhaps be most accurate to describe them. But actually what it is how true and how pure you are being in your conscious projection. So if your conscious projection is dim and is informed only by artifacts that are spoon-fed to you by the construct, then that path is unclear. Life seems pretty aimless. You just feel adrift. And I would hope that very, very few, if any, people listening to this are trapped in that paradigm. And if they are, they're aware of it and they're taking steps courageously and brilliantly to act on that, just like we all have to do every day in all our lives. But for those people who aren't aware of it, they are completely gripped by something that dictates what their reality is. And you can sit in the same room with them, you can have a coffee with them, you can walk past them in the street, you can share a bed with them, and everything looks very normal. But the movement of consciousness and the resonance of consciousness is becoming so polarized here now that it is no longer feasible for some people to be in a low consciousness situation, particularly, of course, with people. But this doesn't only emanate from human beings. It can be a landscape, it can be a building, it can be a society, it can be a company, it could be anything. Low consciousness situations are just intolerable for a lot of people. And speaking to I know you and I were at the ARC conference in February, and a lot of people I spoke to had echoed the sentiment that their lives had started to move in quite radical ways, in that they had decided to leave their husband or leave their wife, or they had left that job that was very safe and comfortable, or they had decided to maybe think about moving to a different country and taking what looks on paper, if you will, as risky, big moves. And yet, when you question them about that and when you discuss that with them, they say, well, there was really no alternative. There was no way I could deal with that shit any longer. That low consciousness, which wasn't ill-intended necessarily. It wasn't, somebody wasn't doing something horrible to them, necessarily.
Sure.
It was just a place of ignorance. It was a place of disavowal. And they said they could not do it any longer. And as I say, this is young, old, male, female, married, single, really fringe people, really straight, normal people. Anyone who was looking at this information and who was shining any sort of flame on the authenticity of their own life has started to acknowledge that once you do that, as soon as you change the internal landscape, this is basic Buddhism, as soon as you change the inside, the outside starts to change. So you can't change your life by rearranging the objects on the outside, getting a better job, marrying a different person, living in a different apartment, going to a different country. It doesn't work like that. That's bullshit. What you have to do is change from where that emanates, which is your own consciousness, your own channel, your own illumination. And that is where this place springs from, nowhere else.
I was thinking about something you wrote as well in your article that we're talking about here. Basically, it has to do with the idea that, well, you said we cannot just let things go unresolved, try as we might, as a kind of a reason for why we're in the bad state we're in, and why things are getting worse all the time as well, in that sense, because in one way it has to do with the idea that the more we ignore the incoming change that is happening, the more we try to ignore and suppress that, the worse it will get, and that can maybe lies an underground, a fundament for a reason for why things are so shitty as they are today, and the fact that they're getting worse as well, because it has to do with this refusal to address these problems, if we can term that people generally overall then are not, they're not in this space that you're talking about. They're not addressing the basic ideas, and so therefore collectively, I guess, on a collective scale as humanity, we are getting it worse all the time. Because one puzzle here for me has always been why is it this particular path that we've gone down then? Why not the positive route, and the negative aspects were the minority, so to speak? But it seems in the external world, if I put it that way, it's always evil, or the dark side, if we can term it that wins, or that is predominant here in that case. What do you think, Neil?
Yeah, it is quite pants, really, isn't it? I would say that, again, let's go to a basic Buddhist precept. Take responsibility for yourself. That is something a lot of people don't do. They expect people to help them, solve things for them, lay the road out for them, etc., etc. Understanding that your reality is your responsibility is a key thing here. And again, the scientific or the reductionist mindset that always has the impulse to reduce things down to systems and mechanics and particles and deterministic principles is not helpful here. So although that is perhaps good, for building aeroplanes and making, Greek salads and what have you, it doesn't help with this process. So we don't have to eject that rational analytical impulse, because critical reason is very important on this process. We don't want to just become like woo-woo weirdo space bunnies. That's not good. Nobody wants to see that. But we can suspend certain filters at certain times. What this really boils down to is that many people in their lives encounter the same problems over and over again. Kind of like recurrent experiences that we all see, we all know, we all understand, like dissatisfaction at work, problems with individuals, lack of something, unfulfilling relationships, or like a sense of powerlessness or purposelessness. And this repetitive experience just perpetuates over and over again. And we hear these stories all the time, and they're essentially, take the names away, take the place names away, take the words, that describe the sort of...
And you have the same story there.
Individual components, and indeed you do. You have exactly the same story. It's always the same. And I'll resist the temptation to give humorous examples, but we all know what we're talking about. All these fucking stories that people are always moaning about how something bad has happened and things aren't right and stuff. And it's commonly accepted that these things are somehow just part and parcel of life. And there's agreement that people are sort of quietly expected to just get over it. Yeah? And so, as we said earlier, going out for the evening, having a laugh, going to a movie, and all that sort of stuff, one would hope relegates all that trauma and all that dissatisfaction to just sort of background noise that can just about be handled. And for those who sort of can't consign the woes to, oh, well, that's life, garbage. For those people who can't do that, then you end up becoming depressed, and you end up going to see a doctor or a therapist or whatever, and there's pharmaceutical products that are designed to displace the offending sort of emotional vortex and temporarily render it mute. And all they're really trying to do is saying, yeah, we know what that's like, but tough shit, this will make you feel a bit better, but you can still go to work. It just still makes you operational.
Repair the machine or put that back so you can push the buttons or whatever. Yeah. That's
right, yeah. It doesn't go to the root of it. And as long as there's a steady supply of chemicals and pills, the counterbalance continues to work that fakery.
Up to a certain point, yeah.
Up to a certain point. And, people can get out of bed in the morning, can go about the business, but it doesn't address the issue. It doesn't address the root issue here. And, you can see it. It's a sad thing in society. Every year we continue to see sort of increasing levels of mental health problems in all strata of society, from the most underprivileged, underclass, to super wealthy people, middle class, business, politics, academics, entertainment, whatever. This viral gloom moves without any physical or social restriction. It is accepted as part of life. Everybody feels it. And I would say that it's a unifying aspect of the human condition in some way, just as we must all eat and excrete and draw breath. So we must encounter like this kind of emotional turbulence. But what I say is that these emotional triggers are key things for us here. These emotional feelings are key. So when you are, let's say you're 35, you're married, you've got 2 young kids, you go to a job that you hate, you're always struggling, things aren't too cool, and, it's difficult. And the emotional reaction is one of dissatisfaction and one of, perhaps latent depression. And that depression is designed to do something. That depression is there for a purpose. That depression is there to say, you're off track, mate. You are off track. And if you continue to move off track, that rut, that plow, that line in the soil that you keep drawing just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. So the emotions are there for a reason. And we shouldn't classify them as nice emotions like happiness and joy and bliss and ecstasy, and then horrible ones like depression and melancholy and gloom and so on. It doesn't work like that. They're just energies, they're just vibrations. Some are high, some are low. Some have big amplitude, some have low amplitude. Some move quickly, some move slowly. And they're there for a reason. They're there as a kind of interface between consciousness, the psyche, the brain, the ego, the spirit, all these different components, whatever words you want to use them. But they always insist upon presenting themselves, and they do that for a reason. They want us to go to the roots. They want us to go deeply into what causes this apparent dysfunction. And they want us to do that before this thing ever manifests itself as any sort of discord or pain. So the emotion is trying to help you. It's trying to say, look, this is off track. This isn't your trajectory. This isn't what you're supposed to be doing. And society says, ignore that, forget that, put it in the dustbin, forget it, it's rubbish. We all have that problem. Haha, never mind, take a pill, have a beer.
Yeah.
What the emotion is trying to do is get you on track, is show you where you need to be. And the emotion knows. The emotion is the vehicle, if you like, for that energy manifestation to say, hey, you know what? The world is big, interesting, mysterious, and it is designed with love for your growth. That's what it is. And that is why so many people have so many difficult emotional problems, and so many people struggle with this stuff. And, you know, pretty cool people and pretty stupid people as well. Nobody is exempt from this. And the key to it is to understand that we need to some extent move beyond the eyes and the ears and the mouth and the nose, and say that reality is only one translation through this sensory array that we have. And these 5 senses that are designed to allow us to navigate and keep the physical vessel healthy are not sufficient for the growth of transcendence that is what we're actually here to do. So we have to begin to go beyond that and begin to look at this system, which is perhaps characterized by, you know, these 7 key points on the body that run from the crown to the base of the spine. And these are called seals or chakras or portals, depending on the spiritual system or the tradition that one uses. And these portals are very real, you know, though they're not still not emphatically acknowledged by Western medicine. Their effects can be directly experienced. And, you know, each of these portals is responsible for dealing with a specific vibration of energy and its corresponding density of form. So, for example, the center portal, which we sometimes call the heart portal, or the heart chakra, its job is to transmute a vibration of energy that we call emotion. And it ranges from what you might describe as a negative spectrum of polarity, from energies that emanate from anguish and separation to joy and empathy and love. And its job is as a compass. The heart is a compass. And this information is so old. It's so old. 25,000 years old, this information. There's no excuse for people to disown it and to move away from it. Because as you pointed out earlier, the more we do this, the more we disown this stuff. As I said in the article, what happens is these problems return. And every time the problems return in our lives, whether it's a job or a person or a feeling or this or that, it gets harder and harder to disown, more and more dense. And so in the example I gave in the article, if we say like an initial single ignored emotional impulse might turn into like initially a mild apathy in a relationship particularly, whether that's a friend or a loved one or whatever. And then that may again be disowned, and then it turns into discontent, and again further disownment of it, and just say, oh, forget, just ignore that, whatever. Then it becomes dysfunction. And finally, it might result in total separation, total abandonment of that person or their abandonment of you. And this, again, occurs over and over. What we have to do is identify that incipient emotion and comprehend it. And in that way, as I mentioned again in the article, we can short-circuit this escalation routine, because that escalation is there to help us. It won't let us get away with ignoring the responsibility of our own creation. So although we take the small example of somebody who ignores an emotion and then it fucks up their relationship with somebody special, if you look at it on a collective scale, if you zoom out and achieve a better resolution on this and look at it from a larger movement of energy, that disavowal gets more and more and more dense and eventually creates adversaries in the world, negative forces in the world that we would call violent or evil perhaps, although those words have their own connotations. But adversaries that are out there that appear to be conscious and real and can kick you in the teeth. This is what happens when you consistently disown your own responsibilities. And
then on the bigger scale, obviously, again, we can see this unfolding as the dystopia as well. On the bigger scale, we're experiencing a cultural depression as well, financial collapse or other things obviously happening in that process as well.
And I would say, and this is a very sort of glib, pithy statement, but I would say that is our fault.
Yeah, it is.
And that is our fault as human consciousness, not as Henrik or Neil or Bob or Sarah, but as human consciousness. That is our job, to create what we see around here, and we all own it.
And participatory in that process in one way
exactly,
or another.
Yeah. So if we're fed up with something, we can choose either to acknowledge it and see it as part of our own inner landscape, or we can choose to just ignore it. And when you ignore it, life has this habit of continually repeating those problems in your life. And again, going back to those analogies, a very classic one is that there is a certain sort of psychic impulse, a certain sort of person who exhibits this impulse, where they encounter a problem in the workplace, which usually manifests as a person, an unpleasant person in the workplace. And they put up with it and have sleepless nights, and, you know, they're upset. It seems very unjust and so on. And then they go away and one day decide to leave, and then they go to a new place, and initially it's okay and it's good and it's much better and everyone's cool and it's great. And there's a car parking space right outside the front door. It's brilliant. And then a few months later, there is another person in that workplace who is unpleasant. There is another person there who represents the same person as last time. And this, I know examples of these cases